Washington.
About half of Americans, 53%, say that one-sided news is a very big problem.
Welcome to the Washington Tech Policy Podcast.
The latest tech law and policy news and brightest tech law and policy experts wherever you are.
So you can stay informed, on the move, in less time.
From Washington, D.C., it's the Washington Tech Policy Podcast.
With Joe Miller.
Joe Miller.
Facebook raises eyebrows in its partnership with the Menlo Park Police. Has the relationship fostered racial profiling? Also, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Facebook's own employees are pressuring CEO Mark Zuckerberg to hold politicians accountable for their false statements. And Elisa Shearer is my guest. Hey everybody, Motherboard reports on Facebook's comfortable relationship with the Menlo Park Police Department. Apparently, Facebook is paying the city of Menlo Park some $2 million per year, a large sum for a small city, to have a dedicated police force for Facebook's campus. One of the things the Facebook unit does is monitor for thefts of bikes the company sets out for its employees. The employees aren't permitted to leave the bikes outside of Facebook's campus, but they often do it anyway. Sometimes citizens in the neighboring community, East Palo Alto, use the bikes. The majority of citizens in East Palo Alto are Black or Latinx. One of the people the cops picked up for using one of the bikes was Latinx, but it turns out the employee was a Facebook contractor. So citizens and advocates have called out the police and Facebook for working together on racial profiling. It's a long read, but you can find the full report in the show notes. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez blasted Facebook on Twitter Saturday, calling the company's political behavior, quote, increasingly disturbing. Connecting the dots, the Congresswoman noted that Zuckerberg claimed he didn't know when Facebook discovered the Cambridge Analytica scandal, that Zuckerberg met with Trump and the far right, then started allowing disinformation ads, and that Zuckerberg didn't tell the whole truth about fact checkers. She says that Facebook acts like they're just an innocent bystander, but that Facebook's decisions have become more and more disturbing. According to the New York Times, hundreds of Facebook employees wrote an open letter to Mark Zuckerberg, urging him to hold ads placed by politicians to the same high accuracy standard as those placed by any advertiser. The House has passed a third election security bill designed to prevent foreign interference in the 2020 election. The bill passed 221 to 181, mostly along party lines. The act is dubbed the SHIELD Act, and it targets paid online political ads. Republicans raised First Amendment concerns about the bill, and the American Civil Liberties Union said that it sweeps too broadly. According to Reuters, Russian operatives attempting to interfere with the platform ahead of the 2020 election are trying to remain invisible by sacrificing followers. Facebook is specifically flagging accounts that grow very quickly. Google employees are claiming that the company is creating a tool to monitor calendar invites to try and prevent staffers from organizing. The tool would apparently flag employees that create events with more than 10 rooms or 100 people. Google denies that the tool is designed to thwart organizing efforts. The Pentagon awarded its 10-year, $10 billion Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure JEDI contract to Microsoft, closing it off from Amazon, which was expected to win the deal, as it was considered by many analysts to have the best capabilities. But Microsoft, too, has the highest military security rating possible. A former speechwriter for former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said that President Trump wanted to, quote, screw over Amazon and its CEO Jeff Bezos, who also owns the Washington Post, one of the news outlets the president thinks is biased against him. But the Pentagon states that its awarding of the contract to Microsoft is in line with an overall multi-platform strategy that can't be handled by a single vendor. Finally, Google announced a quantum computing milestone last week, saying that it had developed a microprocessor that took minutes to perform a calculation that would have taken the world's best supercomputer thousands of years. And you can find links to all these stories in the show notes. Stay with us.
Washington, the inclusive voice of tech policy.
Because America won't stand still for the same old insiders. Washington, moving the needle.
My guest today is Elisa Shearer. She's a research associate at the Pew Research Center. She earned her master's in communications, culture, and technology from Georgetown and a bachelor's in psychology from Houghton College, from which she graduated Magna Cum Laude. Please welcome Elisa Shearer. Elisa, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So Mark Zuckerberg announced last week that Facebook will begin rolling out a new news tab to try and strengthen the relationship between social media and journalism. But according to a report you co-authored with Elizabeth Grieco recently, Americans aren't so upbeat when it comes to social media's role when it comes to news. What are the broad strokes here? So
Americans are largely pessimistic when it comes to the role that social media companies are playing in delivering the news on their sites. So 62% of Americans say that these social media companies have too much control over the news that people see. And then just 15% say they have not enough control, that they want them to have more control.
And so how fairly did survey respondents think that social media platforms determine which news organizations are worthy of being amplified?
Yeah, so very few people say that social media companies treat all news organizations the same. Just 16% of people say that. 82% say that these companies are treating some news organizations differently than others. But you could argue that, well, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe they're prioritizing news organizations that have high reporting standards, for example. That's certainly what social media companies tend to say that they're trying to prioritize. But there's a little bit of disagreement between the public and these companies there. When we ask people what types of news organizations they say they think social media companies are prioritizing, people tend to say news organizations that produce attention-grabbing articles, for example, that have a lot of social media followers, news organizations whose coverage has a certain political stance. They're a lot less likely to say, yeah, they're prioritizing organizations that are well established, that are good at reporting, who are politically neutral.
So we've heard a lot about media bias. How do Americans see news bias on social media?
So media bias is a complicated topic to think about on social media, just because we know that a lot of the news that people are getting there is coming directly from news organizations, but a lot of it is also coming from their family and friends. And maybe they're seeing commentary on top of these news articles when they're seeing it on social media. But we do know that about half of Americans, 53%, say that one-sided news is a very big problem when it comes to news on social media. One-sided news and inaccurate news, that's really people's main concern.
So how much do Americans rely on social media for news, and which platforms do they tend to use most often?
An increasing number of Americans are getting news from social media. 55% get news there often or sometimes. And as you might expect, Facebook is the most commonly used site for news. 52% of Americans get news there. Followed by YouTube, 28% of Americans get news there, and 17% of Americans get news on Twitter.
So what stood out as far as the demographics of the users of these different platforms are concerned?
Yeah, in the report, we go through the demographics of the news users of a bunch of these sites. The most interesting thing to me is that 69% of Snapchat's news users are 18 to 29. Compare that to a site like Facebook, where just 23% of their news users are 18 to 29. So you can really see the age skew there. Other findings include that Facebook and Reddit have their news audiences are more likely to be white. For Snapchat and Instagram, their news audiences are more likely to be non-white.
Well, Elisa, thanks so much for your research here.
Thank you, Joe.
Now we'll turn to the icebreaker and get some career advice from you and hear about your book pick this week. So what's the best career advice you've ever heard?
The best career advice I'd ever heard is that if you're on the fence about applying for a job, always apply. Worst case scenario, it's just good interview practice.
Interesting. What are you reading these days?
I was actually reading this morning, the team at the Pew Research Center that studies the internet put out an internet future report, which is really cool. They talk to experts and talk about where the internet will be in 50 years. And it's surprisingly optimistic.
Well, thanks, Elisa, for joining me. Do you have any final ideas you'd like to leave with us before we close? And where can we find you online?
Yeah, I think overall Americans tend to be really conflicted about news on social media. Most of them expect it to be kind of inaccurate, but they also like the convenience and the speed of it. So I'm really interested in studying this as time goes on. And you can find me on Twitter at Elisa Shearer, and my research lives on pewresearch.org.
You've been listening to Elisa Shearer, Research Associate at the Pew Research Center. Elisa, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
That concludes episode 207 of the podcast. Thanks so much to all of you for listening. If you like what we do here, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment, head over to Apple Podcasts, give it a review. It helps others know what they can expect from the show and helps us out tremendously. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you back here next week. Take care.
Washington.